Ano ka?
The Boat People is a great example of an artist's moving image work that imagines or fictionalizes a map, one that's drawing on little known, interconnected details of the displacement of people across Southeast Asia during the Cold War, while at the same time projecting or imagining a speculative place and time. The story of this short video is set on an island with an emblematic past, and now the island is imagined as if it is the world, and it is the world in end time, the world at the point of extinction. The last 5 humans on Earth disembark on this island. They encounter relics, replicas, and many objects, which they then reproduce in wood. They make wooden sculptures and they burn these objects, these replicas, as a gesture of care and of connecting the past with possibilities of the future. The starting point for this work, says Duan, is the place in which it was made, a place called Bataan, which is a coastal province in the Philippines, which had a small yet regionally emblematic role during the Cold War as a landing site for refugees from Indochina. In an interview, he tells me that the film was inspired by and designed as a kind of letter to Bataan, to the history of Bataan from the future of the world. He says, I spent about a week at Bellas Artes, which is an art center in Bataan, in 2018, where I got a chance to visit all the museums and the various historical sites. He says, the coast of Southeast Asia are such remarkable places, ridden with histories of migrations and traumas. I remembered returning to Saigon quite baffled about the ways that one can genuinely approach a site like Bataan and all of its histories of trauma. The way that the Boat People makes temporal and speculative cinematic form is through rhythmically and energetically charting the wandering, encountering, and the labor of creating, caring, and becoming of these 5 scrawny, brown-skinned young humans. Importantly, it does this aesthetic work of temporalization and speculation through figuring the children's ritualistic communion with objects. Importantly, it does this aesthetic work of temporalization through figuring the children's ritualistic communion with objects and centering its story around conversational scenes of human sociality with a more than human being. At the heart of this fable are the conversations at the shore between the girl, the last girl in the world, and a being of some kind, maybe a goddess, maybe a ghost. A statue that's also a head that talks, that says that she has accumulated all the stories through time of this place and has played this through a lot. The Boat People's staging of an intimate conversation between a human and a more than human exemplifies a certain tendency shared by a number of Southeast Asian artists' moving image works. This concerns the translation or the transposition of practices in animistic ecology, especially the practices whereby humans relate to and communicate with spirits into moving image and installation forms. My proposition here is to define the category of Southeast Asian artist moving image, giving it a definition in terms of a model of enunciation connected to the region's genealogy of animism. When animism is understood here, not so much in terms of the more common notion of objects having soul and agency, but more within the regional paradigm of animism as Southeast Asian practices and apparatuses of human spirit, sociality, and communication. This animistic model of enunciation is one that concerns a kind of hierarchical and ritualistic dynamic of communicative utterance. Here, communication or enunciation is the performativity of powerless beings in acts of addressing opaque and powerful beings. So, instance, animism is defined here as practices whereby powerless and precarious humans do actions and rituals to address locally sovereign or locally powerful spirit beings. It's a model of communication whose emblematic scene would be rituals of offerings, whereby precarious humans act on their wish for the continuation and even the enrichment of existence. In other words, act in the hope of orientating towards the future's possibility, and doing so by addressing opaque, unknowable, and powerful spirit forces and beings. The performativity and the potentiality of enunciation in this case is intertwined with the risk, the indeterminacy, and the wildness of addressing the opaque and the unknowable. My invocation of the category of Southeast Asian artist moving image comes from watching and thinking about artist work while reading a body of scholarship in contemporary anthropology. So here I'll just give a quick nod to an important emerging area of conversation between Southeast Asian anthropological work on animism and what's been termed as theories or philosophies of new animism. An important publication in this context is a recent book called Animism in Southeast Asia, edited by two anthropologists, Guido Springer and Karl Jarnum. Whereas the resurgence of theoretical and post-humanist philosophical interest in animism tends to focus on the liveliness of objects, this edited book collection proposes a way of thinking about Southeast Asian animism in terms of this hierarchical communicative practice, which constitutes a condition of possibility of existence and the agency of humans who are powerless. Within Western contemporary art and cinema, and also within curatorial discourse, animism has been influentially reframed as a method of looking at the epistemological and symbolic violence of acts of boundary making. So here animism becomes a history of the creation of such binaries as the modern versus the primitive, the West versus the other. The conversation between Southeast Asian anthropology and new animism gives me another conceptual route for theorizing Southeast Asian artist moving image, and one that's more attentive to the dynamic of communicative utterance or the dynamic of cinematic enunciation, asking such questions as how do artist moving image works create or perform aesthetics of communicative address, rather than being overly concerned with how works create the effects of the animation or the liveliness of things on screen. And this approach is also more interested in such questions as how artist moving image practices imagine possibilities of future existence or the potentialities of life, existence, in the aftermath of the violence of colonization and national independence. And now I'll talk about several other works which, alongside the Boat People, I think exemplify different aspects of the animistic or the enunciative tendencies of Southeast Asian artist moving image.
พร้อมนะคะ
พร้อมค่ะ
พี่มาเที่ยวกันเหรอคะ
เป็นชีวประวัติเขียนจากชีวิตพี่คนนี้ค่ะ คุณต้าเขาเป็นนักเขียนชื่อดัง สวยนะคะ สวยมาก
สวยนะคะ
ใช่จ้ะสวยมาก
ทำไมตอนนั้นพี่ถึงตัดสินใจเข้าร่วมอะคะ
เพราะอยากให้ทุกอย่างถูกต้องอยากให้มีประชาธิปไตยสมัยนั้นมันเป็นไปไม่ได้เลยที่จะไม่เข้าร่วม
มองอะไรล่ะก้มหน้าลงไป
โหดเลยพี่โหดเลย
แล้วช่วงนี้ทำอะไรอยู่อะ
ทำเป็นหนังเรื่องนึงต่อเข้ามาน่าสนใจเหมือนกันเว้ยมันเป็นหนังอินดี้แต่มันก็น่าลองนะเว้ยเพราะว่าผู้กำกับเขาบอกว่าตอนที่เขาเขียนบทอ่ะเขาคิดถึงกูอยู่เลย
พี่ว่าแอนเข้าใจพี่ผิดอยู่อย่างหนึ่งนะพี่ไม่ใช่ประวัติศาสตร์ที่มีชีวิตหรอกพี่เป็นแค่ผู้รอดชีวิต
Anocha Suwichakornpong's feature film, By the Time It Gets Dark, isn't a ghost film at all, and it doesn't thematize animism in any direct way. The sketch of a plot references a young female filmmaker who's in the middle of trying to make a film about the massacre of students and communists at Thammasat University in Bangkok in 1976. And from this sketch of a plot, Anocha creates a labyrinth of mirroring images, creates fragments which multiply possible films within this film and within this film, and creates a sort of proliferation of scenes of film shoots within film shoots within film shoots. This is a really oblique film that doesn't commemorate, and deliberately it doesn't provide an alternative representation of the massacre or its traumas in the present. The film adopts this sort of mirroring structure. A technical term for this would be a mise-en-abîme structure. And that structure fictionalizes an artist's failure to represent. Anocha uses this complex structure with its sense of the inability to represent, a sort of vortex of representation, to evoke an ambience of a people existing in the long aftermath of the horror, and not quite knowing that this is the shared fact or the medium of existence in this country, in this place, and this time. It's a film whose subtle courageousness is to thematize an effort to know that which exceeds the filmmaker's agency, or the filmmaker's ability to represent. Among the many things that strike me about By the Time It Gets Dark is how Anocha begins the film. And she begins the film with this figure of the filmmaker trying to make a film, making this gesture of beginning, gesture of commencement. The film begins with this gesture of communing with an invisible presence. Animism as the figuring of human spirit sociality is a remarkably consistent feature of art filmmaker Apichatpong Weerasethakul's films and installations. His works are very beautifully populated by beings whose ontological status is unclear, it's indeterminate. So is this a tiger or a man? Is this a monkey, a ghost, or a man? His films are populated by such beings. With this image on the left, the question is, are we seeing the body of a medium Or are we seeing the personhood of a life force currently inhabiting a medium's body? Such beings exist in proximity, in relation with humans, and they bring with them the sense of time's openness, the sense of the connection between the past long ago and the present and the possible future. And they bring with them the sense of possibilities of becoming. This is the power of Apichatpong's work. They portray human spirit sociality or human spirit relations as both the fabric of the everyday and as a kind of temporally heterogeneous form. In this film, Cemetery of Splendor, the artist's regular actress, Auntie Jane, here also plays a character called Jane, who is a middle-aged survivor of many things and who's searching for a second or a third or a fourth chance in life. The story is set simultaneously in the present time of a fast urbanizing northeast city in Thailand, in the nihilistic national time of the repetition of another military coup, another coup cycle in the country, and also in a more complex, heterogeneous time, the duration connecting the deep past of this northeastern region, its deep past as being part of the Lao Lan Chang kingdom, connecting that aspect of the past long, long ago with a fragile possibility of becoming even in this present. Apichatpong's film portrays a world diminished by dictatorship and increasingly captured by frontier capitalism. Yet Cemetery of Splendor still evokes the still possible connection between the past long, long ago and a potentially different future. It does so through such formal features as the play of artificial light in the film and through the gesture of one being touching another, very simple and beautiful gestures of touching. Those aspects of form or the aesthetics of the film, what it does is it creates an aesthetics which diffuses intense, intimate and affecting energy of relating spirits. And it creates a cinematic form of an animistic world, an animistic ecology in this sense. The world as portrayed by the film is simultaneously the world of capitalist end time, the world of political hopelessness, and the world as a realm of human spirit relations and as a radius of spirit territoriality affecting energy and power. Another artist whose works evoke a temporally heterogeneous world populated by ontologically indeterminate figures and beings, and a sense of place that intertwines the deep past, the time long, long ago, with the dystopian present, is an artist called Trinh Thi Nguyen, who lives and works in Hanoi. Thi makes essay films, essayistic films with documentary elements, and often she sets herself the constraint of working with found footage. One of her most significant films to date, a video called Letters from Panduranga, is an essay film that partly reworks a famous essay film, Chris Marker's Letters from Siberia, and she uses the form of letter writing, the epistolary structure of utterance, to reflect on the question of the responsibility of the engaged artist in authoritarian capitalist Vietnam to speak of urgent issues of catastrophic development and to try to meet, or at least to not to totally evade, the expectation to speak for people with far less social status. Yet all the while knowing and feeling that this is an impossible responsibility for an artist. Letters from Panduranga implies that all that an artist and and an artwork can do is to relate, to connect, and to make work, so make moving image works as a way of thinking and thinking through this dilemma, this impossible place of speaking as an artist. One way that T decenters the symbolic agency of the artist as having a privileged speaking position about social issues is to portray the world in South Vietnam, so the world that the artist narrator in Letters from Panduranga is traveling in and through, to portray this world in cosmological terms as both the South Vietnam of the present, one of whose conflictual issues is the plan to build a nuclear power plant on the ancestral land of the Cham people. So to portray this world that the artist narrator is traveling through as a present-day world, and as a world whose deep past, whose past long ago, is still somehow present. So a world that's still connected to the civilizational Champa kingdom that the area had been part of. So T's work speculates this connection between the present and the deep past through various ontologically indeterminate figures. This includes figures such as the middle-aged woman, and portrayed in the film very beautifully and mysteriously, as simultaneously the anonymous, voiceless, uncomplaining female laborers of the present, but at the same time suggesting also that the film is imagining these female figures as mythical figures, almost figures from another time, as matriarchs of a quietly still ongoing civilization with links to the Champa kingdom of the time very long ago. Ho Sun Yen's The Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia shares a particular kinship with Anocha's feature film By the Time It Gets Dark, in terms of their complex and nicely resonating approaches to artistic expression or to communication as a complex artistic form. This project comprises a web database, video installation, live audio-visual performance, and VR work, whose starting point is to ask what constitutes the unity of Southeast Asia. It's very digitally baroque in its excessive aesthetics and in its fragmentary form. His project draws inspiration from the acronymic convention by which the region is quite commonly figured, SEA. And the project serializes an alphabetical expanse of regionally resonant keywords. So A then stands for altitude, anarchism, and so on. And via an open-ended and a partly automated process, the project places the keywords that Sun Yen has been collecting during his long years of artistic research engaging with Southeast Asian studies, collating that in relation to an ecology of very wide-ranging images sourced from the internet. The web database version of the dictionary of this work is programmed so that a constantly mutating assemblage is algorithmically created. Each time we click on an alphabetical tab on the website, a montage appears on the screen, accompanied by a multi-vocal narration, speaking and rapping a possible definition of a keyword associated with the region. The Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia suspends informational content, yet it reaffirms the necessity of enunciating the foundational question that it poses. And it proposes as productive or as generative in itself the speculative process and form and the performativity of uttering some answers to this question, no matter how obliquely. In this sense, it might be characterized as an artistic research project that produces a kind of X dictionary, when the prefix X is understood here as other than its common meaning as a former state or as an outside. So that which no longer has a bearing or a relationship to the phenomenon or the matter at hand. Instead, X in this notion of X dictionary signals that which exists essentially in relation to and beyond that thing, beyond that entity, that which is with it and around it. The X is with the thing as the as yet, the negative presence or the potential. In this period of the institutional canonization of Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art, Sun Yen relates to the dominant structuring or the dominant definition of regional artistic practices and discourses by producing this kind of excommunication, if you like. Rather than adding to the communicational enterprise of canonization, usually done by big, powerful institutions, or the creation of a functional, conventionally legible category concerning Southeast Asia as a region and its art or cinematic arts, his project produces this utterance, produces an enunciation in relation to and around this structural enterprise to define Southeast Asian art. So what the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia does instead is to create an excess of partially automated content and a suspension of communicative transparency or communicative instrumentally, while at the same time the process and this excessive form of the project is still orientating towards the potential unity and sufficiency of a possible Southeast Asia. Sun Yen's project simultaneously questions the apparatus of knowledge and discourse while affirming as open, endless, and desirable the desire to know what is the unity of Southeast Asia. With this interest, his project parallels artist Araya Ratnamran Suk's anarchic series of video installations, the Two Planets series, and Village and Elsewhere, carried out from the mid-2000s for around 7 years. Among contemporary Southeast Asian artists, Araya is to me the most fascinating and the most challenging of them all. She's most well known and controversial for her performances and installations, staging intimate and irreverent conversations with dead bodies. Within art historical discourse, Araya is most often situated within the canon and the generation of 1990s Thai contemporary art, and also as a key figure in a mode of art sometimes known as the Southeast Asian global conceptualist turn of that decade. With the Two Planets and Village and Elsewhere series, Araya decenters and displaces the westernized apparatus of public viewing of art. In this particular video, which is very funny, Araya places the gold frame reproductions of two famous Western artworks by Koons and Janjileshi in a sermon hall in the neighborhood Buddhist temple near her house on the outskirts of the northern city of Chiang Mai. The video is a one-shot documentation of a humorous sermon delivered by the temple abbot, extolling the virtues of key Buddhist precepts through his commentary on these reproductions. So he's narrating their visual content and he's projecting or making up narratives about their possible Buddhist useful image. The congregation of children and aunties, which includes the artist herself in the back row, and these dogs that come in and out of the frame, match the abbot in the humorous unpredictability of their responses to the reproduced paintings and to his sermon. Araya's video stages a very complex tableau, at once displaying a scene for viewing and undermining a certain established westernized apparatus and logic of exhibiting artworks and viewing them in a certain way. So she stages a kind of encounter or a clash between one tradition of viewing and another which is so much more participatory, so much more premised around immersion in relating to performances and to artworks via oral improvisation, incantation, and a kind of active call and response between the works themselves, the narrator of the works, and the spectators around this scene of displaying of the work. In this way, Alaya's Village and Elsewhere series returns us to a key question concerning the task of creating knowledge or of theorizing the Southeast Asian in Southeast Asian art or cinema. So the task being one of thinking through the tensions between the so-called universalizing, westernized forms of exhibiting and reception, and local practices connected to genealogies of aesthetic, mediating, and ritual forms and apparatuses that are incommensurable with, exceed, or difficult to subsume under that universalizing logic of exhibiting and viewing artistic and cinematic works. The key issue here might be articulated this way, that theorizing the regionality of cinematic or artistic forms is the task of exploring the tensions and the relationships between local genealogies of art, aesthetics or mediating forms, and the so-called universalizing, westernized apparatus of exhibiting or of creating a mode of spectatorship of artistic and cinematic forms. To put my own research and curatorial endeavors within this frame, I'll just talk a little bit about my recent curatorial project, Animistic Apparatus. One of the activities as part of this project was an exhibition at Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival in Northeast England in 2019, where I had the chance to experiment with translating a regional apparatus, a regional mode of practice of outdoor film projection, an animistic mode of film projection, projecting films outdoors as a kind of practice and a ritual of offering address to local spirits. So at this festival, I had the chance to experiment with translating this genealogy of projecting film to spirits into a mode of installing and projecting moving image works within the institutional, physical and geographical context of this film festival, which is a very experimental film festival situated in a small rural town in the borderland between northeast England and Scotland, and in an area with a residual but strongly living borderland history, borderland sensibility. So myself and the curatorial team asked this question: what if exhibitions weren't primarily addressed to humans? What if humans were incidental to the logic of enacting and displaying exhibitions? So what if humans were neither addressed nor excluded from an exhibition? Because an exhibition is taking place as a way of addressing spirits. And from this speculative premise, we staged a series of encounters between the works of artists such as Apitat Pongwilasetagun, Chris Chongchan Fui, Lucy Davis, and Lav Diaz. So we installed their works within archaeological sites, within outdoors or semi-outdoor sites of historical archaeological sedimentation across this little town. These were such sites such as a stone-walled space which felt very much like a cave, which existed under the arches of the town's main bridge. The place called the Ice House that historically was used to store ice for the transatlantic salmon trade during the 18th century. So this was the space where we installed Apitat Pong's video fireworks archives. We also experimented with shifting the language of presenting the very long film of Filipino filmmaker Lav Diaz, who's most often discussed as a filmmaker who's notorious for making films that could be up to 9-10 hours long, and who's most often validated through a discourse of appreciation, a discourse of value creation of his films around the idea of slow cinema, and which brings with it the idea of cinephile commitment to his works as displaying an appetite for watching his very long films straight through. So a kind of appetite for marathon endurance of very long films. So instead of echoing that kind of a language or a way of valuing or showing appreciation for Lav Diaz's films, we experimented with presenting one of his films, A Lullaby to the Sorrowful Mystery, as a nighttime, a nocturnal projection ritual. So we frame this exhibition event as an animistic film projection event, which is an offering to the beings, the spirit beings of this little town, Berwick upon Tweed. And we played the film all night, not necessarily intending to attract human audiences. So the projection ritual itself was not addressed to humans, not addressed to film lovers and film mad people, but we projected the film outdoors all night in the company of the early autumn, late summer harvest moon, in the company of the stars that shone, in the company of the sea nearby, and the nocturnal creatures that came and spent time with the film. So I think I'll pause my presentation here, and I look forward to having a live conversation with everybody.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, May.
Hi, hello. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, very nice to meet you via the screen.
Hi. Okay, so we just finished your presentation. There's a little bit of delay. So this is the time for the Q&A session. I'm Salima, by the way, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for staying for this second keynote session. And I will be conducting this 15 minutes Q&A session with May, with Umi also. And we are so happy that May is joining us today for the Q&A. And would like to say thank you for the very insightful presentation. There are so many intriguing subjects from your presentation that we can perhaps discuss further in this session. So I'm inviting all participants to join in the discussion, ask questions. You can use the raise hand feature to speak or ask directly your questions to May, or you can also write down your question in the chat box if you like, and we will help read them out loud to you to the floor. So I think we have 15 minutes, right? If we are sticking to the program book, we have 15 minutes. Okay, so yeah, any questions, everyone? Maybe while waiting for questions from other participants, we can start the session with some questions from myself and maybe from Umi later on if there's some. Hi, May, everything okay?
Yep, hearing you loud and clear.
Okay. Okay, maybe I will start off by highlighting a very interesting part mentioned in your presentation that stated how the coast of Southeast Asia as being a remarkable place, written with history, about migration and trauma. And within the context of Indonesia, Indonesia also has the similar traits of places, sites with emblematic past, which also often relates to collective traumatic experience of memories. So my question will revolve around this in regarding to the Indonesian visual arts or artist moving images that you may have come across in your research. Perhaps there are some examples of Indonesian contemporary art or artist moving images that you have come across that perhaps uses a similar approach to that of the boat people, perhaps, that uses a specific emblematic site as a point of entry of the work that you can share with us today?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a really great question to start with. Thank you, Salima. And I think what you identify there, the interest in the boat people, so the interest that you experience in that work with history and with using certain geographic sites, which is, perhaps we can say it's a defining geographic stroke historical feature of Southeast Asia as a region, right? So this is what Tuan Andrew Wynne, that's his starting point. And I think that this is why this work is so interesting and such a great example of contemporary Southeast Asian moving image. So as regards to your question, maybe I'll start this way. And I think the conference participants, you will have picked up on one aspect of the sound quality of this work immediately. The gamelan music is interesting, right? And that was the one Andrew Wynne's deliberate decision to work with a group of gamelan musicians. And my apology, I've forgotten the name of this group, but I'm guessing that they're a group that takes traditional gamelan sound and modernizes that, makes that contemporary. And Doan was, when I interviewed him about this, he talked a lot and very insightfully about why he fell in love with this sound and why he thought this sound was so appropriate. So this team of musicians was so appropriate to collaborate with him with this work. And they created improvisatory music, especially for this work. So in that way, he says, you know, he likes to think of this work as actually a sort of Southeast Asian collaboration, that the sound authorship that you hear in this work is the authorship of the gamelan musicians. And that sound fitted the work very well because it draws on tradition, but it also sounds very, very sci-fi in itself, right? That sense of the possibility that the work is playing around with, that the world is still a world of possibilities, even though the story that this work tells is that this is the point at which the world is ending. You know, we have destroyed the world. So other works that I can think of, not exactly Indonesian, but in some ways we could also say not Indonesian either. And so let's go back to talking about Lafdias. One thing that's very, very interesting about how Lafdias describes what motivates his artistic and filmic practice is that he retrieves the idea of his work and his identity as Malay work. And what he is speculatively playing around with there by saying that his very long films are films which are made from an old practice and sensibility of space and time, which he calls Malay, provocatively. But what he is retrieving there is a geography that comes before the modern emergence of nationhood, before colonization. What is Malay? What was Malay? Malay is a territory linked by sea, connecting many places that we now think of these days as Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, a bit of Siam. Lafdias claims his imaginative prerogative capacity as an artist to disregard all that and to name his film stylistically, aesthetically, politically, what it does as Malay work. So I think another important proposition that Southeast Asian moving image artists and Southeast Asian artists moving image as a particular kind of body of work, what they make is also this proposition to reimagine what the maps that we inhabit, what that could be, what sort of history, when we think about history on a very large scale, very long range history, what sort of history situates us in our existence, where we are now and where we could be heading. So if I could answer that question by using just these two examples, Love Diaz's work, the way that Tuan Andrew Wynn collaborate with artists, different artists in different forms in order just to make that work. To highlight this point that what makes Southeast Asian artists moving image Southeast Asian, that a lot of it is the artist's reimagining of what this map of the region could be.
Okay. Thank you, May, for your answer. We have the first question from participant from, I think, from Doug.
Thank you.
Doug, yes, thank you for the answer.
Thank you, Doug. So I'm just reading the chat now.
Yes.
I think at this point, I'd like to, can Doug speak as well, or are you?
Yep, sure.
Yeah.
Doug,
so this is a really interesting question, and you're kind of making a link between my research interest on how we think about the historical roots of how moving images and performances have been presented in Southeast Asia. And one of the works that film historical works that I do is to look at the way that outdoor cinema screenings in Thailand and borderland territories around Thailand in the early to mid 20th century, how things like 16mm films were projected as part of a religious ritual performances circuit, animistic circuit, in order to displace the idea that cinema was made in order to be shown in cinema theaters, or that films were made in order to be shown in commercial circuits only. So I think, Doug, you're kind of establishing a link here between that historical work and my interest in the possibilities of presenting Love Diaz's work differently and different from the usual sort of convention of presenting art cinema as a prestigious product. Is that right? I just kind of wanted
like
to
that,
check.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And that was why myself and the Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival took the opportunity of the animistic apparatus curatorial initiative to make that provocation in order to indirectly criticize this language of appreciation of Love Diaz's work, this sort of cinephile language of appreciation, which has its roots in a modernist convention of presenting art cinema, coming from, we could trace this back to the way that in the early 20th century, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, that was the first institution that presented films in a way to make the argument that films needed to be taken seriously as an art form. So when the museum started its film screening initiative, I believe it was in the 1930s, it did things which was seen as very unusual, very weird then, of prohibiting people to talk while a film was being screened. So take the film seriously by watching it quietly. And this, over time, this has sort of sedimented and created a kind of institutionalized, 20th century institutionalized way of watching art films and showing appreciation for art films by watching in a darkened auditorium. Things got so extreme that at one point there was a sort of avant-garde experimentation carried out by a space called Anthology Film Archive in New York City, where the experimentation was that they built a cinema auditorium where each seat had this kind of panel to both sides, so that the person sitting
in this seat would not be distracted by anybody else and would have this direct relationship to the screen. That you would be in the cinema, you'd watch really quietly, and you would be communing with the screen only.
Sounds like clockwork.
So, yeah, right. So if you think about what is the history, the local or the regional history of how performances and images or images that move, you know this from wayang in Indonesia, the history of how that form has been presented and how people have historically engaged with this form. I would say that our jobs as advocates, theorists, or students of cinema, art, and moving image grounded in the region and the locality that we are in is to think about and engage with the history of the way that images have been presented in our locality in order to establish a different premise from that sort of Western institutional canonical model of the possibilities of showing films and the language of criticism or the language of appreciation that's created out of a very particular history of how images have been shown. So yeah, so the initiatives, the work that I do around exhibiting Love Diaz's work in the background is very much an agenda to question, critique, and to undermine convention so far for presenting his work, particularly in context of film festival prize-giving events, which has a genealogical link to the way that art cinema as a category was created and shown, and which is never mentioned. That link has now been sort of forgotten, and the idea of showing films in a certain way has been universalized. So I think it is my job to question that and to speculate, experiment with different ways of presenting the works of people like Love Diaz.
Yes. No, I was also just wondering about whether how a film like Love Diaz's would compare to some of the 16mm films, which from what I can tell and images I've seen of festivals and things like that were much quicker, were cut in a much quicker manner, were sort of lively with records and voices and things like this. So I wondered, you know, the spirits who were sort of used to this much more sort of lively kind of media text might have gotten bored as well watching Love Diaz. That was my,
I see what you mean.
It's a little bit of a question.
I think where there is a connection, in terms of pace and tone, you don't see similarities between Love Diaz's style and the genre, fast-paced, cheerful kind of works, Thai 16mm film works that were being made and shown on these circuits in the mid-20th century. But I would say what's interesting and not often picked up on about Love Diaz's work is how, in theoretical language, we call it intermedial, how much his films themselves incorporate different media in different forms. So it's very productive to think of Love Diaz's work in relation to theatre, for instance. Love Diaz is first and foremost a musician. This is a fact that's also not that widely factored into thinking about why he makes his films the way that he does and why his films are so rhythmically interesting. So there is a lot of music, sometimes direct musical performances in his work. There is also an interest in his work in incorporating the ritual form and time of animistic or Christian/animistic conversations with the spirits. So in some of his work that you see that there are certain moments when the film basically goes into full-blown ritual mode. The sort of the sound, the sensorial intensity, the way that the bodies move in certain scenes in his film. That's when his laugh goes totally animistic, ritualistic. So I think it's productive to think of Love Diaz's work within the frame of intermediality. And then I would say the other aspect where Love Diaz's work draw very much from, I think, from his early total immersion in popular cinema. He had a childhood where at weekends he said, him and dad just went off and watched movies all day. the storytelling. Love Diaz's work. It's the work of a great storyteller, but it's the work that shows a great love of people performing and in the moment of telling stories. So you could almost think of the length of his work as they're that long because there are stories within stories within stories within stories. That's why they're that long.
Great. That answers my question and reinterests me in looking at Lav's films again.
Thank you
for the question, Mas Dak. Thank you also for the answer. Is it okay for one more question, May?
Of course, yes, please, fire away.
So if there's any from the audience or the participants that would like to ask May any questions, we still got a little of time to stretch. So yes, I'm inviting any other questions. From Umi, maybe?
My question is simple. When I see your works and your curatorial in Ondonani, I see that you are kind of mixing some methodologies. Like I feel like theory in film is not something that fixed. It is something that you can elaborate, and you show me that you use several approaches like new historicism in the medium, and then you also take a look at the history of the Cold War and how it affects in the Southeast Asia region, and how the artists try to tell their trauma through moving images. And I think my question is like, is it important to a researcher or to a writer in history or in the film theory using some of different approaches or interdisciplinary aspect in his or her research? And is it important also for us to be able to like experimenting our own research to be in public?
The simple answer is yes. Simple answer to a simple but not simple and very important question. The answer is yes. I tell my students this because sometimes the word theory and what we think of as theory, it comes across as scary, and it comes across as like something that you study for an exam and then you forget about it afterwards. So we need to approach this differently. We all need to be fed, and we get fed by interesting ideas. But then what we do is we learn to live with and live those interesting ideas. And I think the most productive way to do it is if you can think of theorizing as something that you can play with, and you play by doing. So to research and to theorize, I think the most generative way to do it, so to do it as part of your living, your being, is that you learn to research, to think, and to theorize in the moment of doing something. So that what I am trying to do is research a phenomenon by getting inside the world of that phenomenon. That's why I curate. That's why I play around with curating a lot, because you learn something really by being inside the moment of the developing or the organization of, let's say, that event, that thing that you want to be part of creating. And that's the moment when you theorize. So it's really important to just shift out of thinking of theory as something that you need to learn for a bit to try to write an essay or pass an exam, because that way you don't hold it in your head. And then it means that the work that you create as part of an academic research is not necessarily part of you. And you don't have to do it that way. I mean, this is my basic message to my students a lot of the time. Well, you don't have to do it that way.
Okay. Thank you, May, for the answer. Thank you, Mbak Umi,
Thank you,
for the
May.
question.
Thank you.
Okay. So
thank you.
I think we have to end this Q&A. I think we have a very limited time frame because we still have a screening from students' work. So I think we have to end the Q&A session. And this has been a delight and insightful conversation. Thank you so much again, May Adadol Ingawanij, for sharing with us this wonderful knowledge and providing us with this awesome discussion. Hopefully, we can meet in a better circumstances and hopefully meet you in person, maybe in IMOVICCON 2023. I don't know, let's cross our fingers. Hopefully everything gets better by then. I wish you the best and best of health. And everybody, let's give a warm applause for May. And we are delighted if you would like to stay to watch, but if you have other engagements, so you can probably leave earlier. Thank you also, Mbak Umi, for conducting the session with me, and everybody for participating in the discussion, for attending IMOVICCON 2021 keynote session. There are more to come tomorrow in the keynote session. We have Max tomorrow sharing with us in the keynote session, and hopefully everybody can come and join us again. So again, thank you, May.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, May.
Thanks, Pelita, Umi, and everyone. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank
Bye.
you. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
And I will give the floor back to Samuel and Michelle at the end of the keynote.
Thank you, Mrs. Ingawanij, Mrs. Lestari, and Mrs. Hakim. Moving right along to our final session, a film screening session by our fellow students, followed by a discussion session. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Perdana Kartawiyuda, our moderator for this session.
Hello. Hello, good afternoon.